Hello and welcome. I'm Melanie Hayden. I'm a lifelong Jane Austen fan, and Persuasion is my absolute favorite Jane Austen novel. This is my first presentation at Virtual Jane Con, and I'm so happy to be part of the amazing lineup of content creators this year. I hope that you're planning to stick around and watch all of the awesome videos that are going to be posted today and tomorrow, because I know I am. So back in April 2021, Netflix announced that Dakota Johnson would star as Anne Elliot in their upcoming adaptation of Persuasion. And I think it's fair to say that Austen fandom collectively winced at that news. Because let's face it, we might complain about the long wait for adaptations, but the ones we get are pretty amazing. We get actors like Jennifer Ehle and Colin Firth and Anya Taylor-Joy and Keira Knightley and Sally Hawkins and tons of other amazing British actors who play our favorite heroes and heroines. And now we have the actress best known as Anastasia Gray trying to bring to life Anne Elliot, maybe the most complex of all the Jane Austen heroines. I mean, obviously Dakota Johnson wasn't the only person in this production, right? The screenplay was being adapted by Ron Bass, and that is a man who knows how to write a rom-com. We're talking about the guy who wrote Waiting to Exhale, How Stella Got Her Groove Back, and My Best Friend's Wedding. And he can also write heavier emotional pieces too without them getting really schlocky. He wrote Rain Man, What Dreams May Come, Stepmom. These are all movies that I have truly loved over the years and have gone back to watch over and over again. And then as the director, you had Carrie Cracknell, and I wasn't familiar with her, but when I looked her up, I found that she had directed some award-winning theater productions at places like the Young Vic and the National Theater. She had also been part of National Theater Live, which is where they stream those productions live into cinemas all over the world. And if you get a chance to see any of her productions, I highly encourage it. They're fantastic. So I was thinking, okay, maybe you have this amazing writer and this amazing director. Okay, maybe this could work. And then they started to announce the rest of the cast, and they were pretty amazing. I could immediately see Richard E. Grant as the perfect Sir Walter, right? And then you have Cosmo Jarvis as Wentworth. He was fresh off Peaky Blinders, which I thought he was excellent in. And then you had Henry Golding as Mr. Elliot, which was, I guess, kind of unexpected because in a lot of the movies that he had been in up until then, he played a hero, right? But then I remembered that Mr. Elliot is supposed to be a hero, and we're supposed to believe that about him right up until the end of the book. And, you know, regardless, we would still get Henry Golding in a cravat, which many of us were looking forward to. And then the one thing that I was actually really excited for this production, even over the competing one that we later learned about, was that they had cast actors of color in key roles. And I really appreciate that in period dramas, especially in Austen, just because it's so close to my heart, and I love when the content creators and the fandom is open in those ways. But, you know, you still have Dakota Johnson. So was I supposed to trust that the actress that was best known as Anastasia Gray was going to be able to capture my beloved Anne Elliot? Even with the filmmakers and the rest of the cast, a lot of us sort of were waiting skeptically and expecting a total hot mess, even if we were also, you know, dreaming about Henry Golding in a cravat. And we had a lot of time to dream about that, because Persuasion didn't actually hit our televisions until over a year later in July of 2022. And during that time, if you remember back, a lot of us were kind of still semi-stuck in our pandemic bubbles, or at least being a little more careful. And a lot of us spent that time obsessively watching and rewatching our favorite Austen adaptations and other period dramas. Sometimes it was to the point that we were surprised when we went outside and everyone around us didn't have a posh British accent. I should also note that during the wait between the announcement of Netflix's version and the release, we found out that a competing version of Persuasion was set to star Sarah Snook and Jill Fry, and that was canceled because this production had kind of stolen its thunder. That was actually the production that I thought had more promise to it, despite some of the cast in this movie too. And to be honest, some of us might have killed some White Claws over that announcement. But anyway, by the time Persuasion finally hit our streaming services almost exactly 2 years ago in July 2022, the critics had already confirmed our very worst fears. The New York Times called it passive-aggressive, which I think is kind of an interesting description of a novel in which the hero kind of spends most of the book pointedly showing his former fiance how blissfully happy he is with his newer, younger model. Variety called it awkward, and then Vox just came right out with it in the title of the review, which was "The Netflix film is a disaster." Don't hold back, right? And then you had a lot of fans that really the early fans that watched it were not complimentary. Rotten Tomatoes to this day still stands at 31%, and I found this great quote from a Redditor who said, "I wanted to gouge my eyes out." Dakota Johnson actually did get a lot of the criticism. The Guardian called her woefully miscast, and Rolling Stone said that she lacked the spark of true wit. So when I watched it like a week later, I went into it ready to be disappointed. And you know what? I was. Even though I am now much older than Anne Elliot, the 27-year-old old maid, that description hits differently in your 30s, younger fans. Just be prepared for that. She is the heroine still that I most identify with and admire, and the one that I would like to think people would compare me to, if that doesn't sound too vain. And here you have Dakota Johnson, and she's like cuddling rabbits and rolling her eyes at the camera and spilling wine in her head, and that's like in the first 20 minutes of the movie. So like a lot of people, I watched it, I complained about it, I told everyone how bad it was, and then I retreated back to the sofa to watch the 1995 version with Karen Hines and Amanda Root, as God intended. And it wasn't until about a year later, after some of that outrage had faded, and Netflix kept recommending it to me, that I remembered some of the better moments, like Richard E. Grant staring into the mirror while reading his page in Burke's. And then I also remembered Mia McKenna Bruce and her hysterically hysterical portrayal of Mary Musgrove. And so finally, with another White Claw, I sat down and I watched the movie again. And with the time that had passed, I was no longer thinking about how amazing Sarah Snook would have been in that first moment that Anne and Wentworth see each other after 8 long years apart. I wasn't even thinking about how Kieran Hines somehow magically pulls off those crazy hats. I was wondering why a writer like Ron Bass, who has proven that he can beautifully capture emotions like grief and loss in movies like What Dreams May Come, wrote our girl Anne as a wry, fourth wall breaking wine aunt. And that train of thought is actually what eventually changed my mind, partially at least, about Netflix's Persuasion. So as much as I and you and a lot of diehard Austen fans love Anne and her story, she's kind of a tough heroine for the modern world. I hear a lot from Austen fans. I run a monthly discussion group for Austen fans in Kansas City here, and I hear a lot that Persuasion is their favorite or one of their favorite of the novels. But if you go to find adaptations or fan-written novels, there's so few of them. It's to the point that in 2018 at the JazzNet AGM that was held here in Kansas City, there was a whole session asking why there was not more fan fiction about Persuasion. We didn't really have a good answer, frankly, but I personally think that a lot of it is because Persuasion starts from this place of like sadness and hopelessness and resignation. And Anne spends most of the book feeling guilty for what she sees as like this sin that she's committed against Wentworth. And then he spends most of it rubbing her nose in what she could have had if she had been brave enough to stick with him. There's no like sparkling flirtation. There's no Lizzie Bennet telling Darcy where he can shove his proposal. There's not even a ball. Anne just kind of quietly mourns, and she believes that she deserves her own sadness. So how do you adapt these heroines for a new world, I think is the question. Claire Tomalin, who wrote that exhaustive biography of Jane Austen, says that Austen wrote Persuasion as a present to herself, to Anne Sharp, who was, of course, the teacher and governess to her niece Fanny, to Cassandra, Jane's sister, to Martha Lloyd, her BFF and longtime housemate, to all women who had lost their chance in life and would never enjoy a second spring. And that is kind of a tough sell for a rom-com, which is, for good or ill, that's what most people expect from an Austen adaptation. I can imagine if you're tasked with writing an adaptation of Persuasion that's going to find an audience outside of Austen fandom who already knows and loves the source material, there's some serious adapting to be done. Because as written, Anne Elliot is so quiet that she almost blends into the wallpaper, right? She's trying to blend into the wallpaper in a lot of cases. She doesn't stand up for herself like other Austen heroines. She fully believes that she is the author of her own misery, with maybe an assist from Lady Russell. She's overlooked, she's not an admired beauty, and she kind of allows all the people around her to act like fools without stepping in to make any judgments or try to stop them. I mean, even Fanny Price, who I think wins the Austen Prize for Meekest Wallflower, she put her foot down when her principles were threatened. You don't really see that from Anne as it's written in the book. Now, like I said, I love Anne Elliot. She is a mature, fully realized character that I think shows some of Austen's best writing. But as a heroine for a 90-minute film, I think she could be a little harder to connect with. And I actually think that a lot of the changes to Anne that the Austen fandom objected to so strongly are attempts to help connect the audience, this new audience, with her. Bass's script and Cracknell's directing give us an Anne with a sense of humor, somebody who is acknowledging the ridiculousness of what's happening around her and even kind of tweaking the noses of her sisters and her father. We immediately understand why the Musgrove girls are so happy to see her and the Crofts befriend her. It's because she's fun. She's somebody that you'd enjoy having dinner with. And I will admit, we get a little bit of that in the 95 Persuasion when Anne picks up her friendship with Mrs. Smith again, but that's pretty far into the material, after she's kind of started to remember the person that she used to be or wanted to be. A Netflix movie has to grab you quick, or you know what, you're going to find that back button and something else to watch. So while the script and the movie in general mostly get criticized for ruining Anne Elliot, almost all the characters are actually adapted into more modern speech and sensibilities. Wentworth is still standoffish, and he's obviously trying to show Anne what a mistake she made, but he's a little bit more wry, a little less staid and stoic and uptight than Book Wentworth. And I mean, I think that's because you have to root for him too, even while he's hitting on a much younger girl just to break Anne's heart a little bit more. And yet it's the portrayal of Anne that viewers and reviewers really seem to object to. And it's true. Like, this is a very different Anne than we've seen on screen before. Amanda Root and Sally Hawkins, from, you know, the most well-known versions, they played versions that were much closer to Book Anne, and we love them for it. I think what we're seeing in the 2022 film is an Anne for audiences that are new to Austen, or at least new to Persuasion, and to an extent, I actually think the adaptations that are made to that are done in a pretty interesting way. Because as much as I said that Anne is a tough heroine for people new to the story to connect with, I think there are some things about her that have very modern and very timely analogs. One of the ones that sticks out to me on later watchings that I think is most interesting is her economic status. Anne's spinsterhood at 27 is basically keeping her shut out of any kind of like upward economic or social mobility. And she grew up in this fairly comfortable station in life, in this comfortable place, but that is pretty much gone now. And there's really almost nothing she can do about it. She also took advice from a parental figure that turned out to be much more suited to an earlier time. And all of that, I think, might sound very familiar to millennials and Gen Z who are still struggling with massive student loans and the inability to buy a house and kind of feel like they're failing in adulthood. And watching the movie again, I noticed that this was all presented in a very overt way. Anne doesn't, like she does in the books, she doesn't make excuses for Lady Russell or for her father. And I think it makes it just hit a little bit harder. She doesn't really forgive them in the same way that she does in the book. I will say I identified pretty hard with the idea of feeling locked out of any of the mechanisms that she could use to improve her own life. Another complaint I heard about the movie was Anne's fourth wall breaking narration, which I will admit was pretty jarring for me, and I was not a fan. I tend to think there has to be a really good reason for narration in a movie, but upon further reflection, I see what they were going for here, and I think they might have had a legitimate reason. So a lot of persuasion happens in Anne's head in the book, right? We'd hardly know that she has a past with Wentworth if we didn't have her internal monologue. We certainly wouldn't know how much that has contributed to her personality as it is now. We also get a lot of information about why Wentworth is a desirable hero from Anne's thoughts, which is super important in this situation, because if we only have his actions, he kind of comes off as a jerk for most of the book. We might be able to see that he's a gentleman and he's been successful in the Navy, but is he really a hero? We don't get a lot of basis for that if we don't have Anne's internal monologue. So in the 2022 movie, I think that the narration is trying to fill that role. And I personally think it doesn't do such a bad job. I know people objected to a lot of the anachronistic terms and figures of speech like, oh, we're X's, or we're worse than X's. But I don't think it's a terribly inaccurate interpretation of Anne's reactions to her interactions with Wentworth, pretty much all the way up until they get to Lyme. Now, I understand that many people, perhaps a great many people, judging by the Rotten Tomatoes reviews, are never going to like this modernized version of Anne Elliot. But there's an awful lot of people who still object to bookworm Lizzie from the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice, or Anya Taylor-Joy's Nosebleed in the 2020 Emma. And as a concept, I think making room for interpretation is really important in the Austen fandom. So I'm of the opinion that if we're going to keep Jane and her stories and her characters alive, and if we want her books to be read and loved and celebrated in another 250 years, we have to make room for those other interpretations. And this movie is trying for something new. It's not a faithful period adaptation of an Austen novel, but it's also not a full-on modernization like Clueless or Bridget Jones's Diary. This is Austen, in my opinion, for people who may not know the source material, but who want to watch a rom-com that has a little more maturity or depth, or want to get started in Austen. And as a starting point, it might not be bad. And once you get past this easily accessible, beautifully shot, and funny movie, who knows where you'll end up. One of my very favorite Jane Austen scholars, Juliet Wells, recently published a new book called A New Jane Austen: How Americans Brought Us the World's Greatest Novelist, which is actually the third in her trilogy of books that kind of talk about how both scholars and fans approach Austen. Now, I already love Professor Wells for the chapter in her book Everybody's Jane titled American Austen Hybrids, which touches on everything from Pride and Prejudice and zombies to the Amish versions of the novels to the R-rated side of AO3. And in fact, Professor Wells actually gives a ton of credit for the continuing popularity of Austen to all of us overly invested fans and the volume of content that we produce in our spare time. But this book is excellent. I highly recommend it. Professor Wells spends a lot of time talking about how it's really been non-scholars who have kept Austen popular with readers over the past 150 years, particularly in America. She devotes a lot of the book to how those lay fans kind of broke down the barriers between scholarly Austen, which was already very accepted in academia, and what she calls everybody's Jane Austen, which is, of course, also the title of one of her books. But it's the afterword to A New Jane Austen that really energized me. Like she did in her previous books, she encourages lay fans and scholars to come together to share our experiences with Austen, and also to, and this is really important, to hold space for people who have different experiences with these books that we love or no experience with them. And I really appreciate that she particularly recognizes the fandom struggle to be an inclusive place for fans of diverse backgrounds, for new fans, for fans from different cultures. And she tells us that we all need to do more to improve that. Now, she is writing from the perspective of a professor and an academic, and so she's mostly writing about how to bring students into Austen spaces primarily through reading the novels, but I actually think the same can be easily said about screen adaptations, because as Professor Wells notes, there's no right or wrong way to come to Austen. There's just different ways. So at the most basic level, every adaptation of a Jane Austen novel interprets the characters in its own way. When the 2005 Pride and Prejudice was first released, I remember some Austen fans just really took issue with Lizzie being kind of this little bit of a dreamy bookworm, because specifically that's something that book Lizzie objects to as a descriptor of herself when it's brought up in the book. And then you had the people, of course, who complained about her running around with her hair down. It's a very important criticism. But even like the 1995 version, which most fans, I think, consider to be the most perfect version that is out there, it wasn't a universal hit when it first happened. Please do not Google People Magazine's review of Jennifer Ely in the miniseries. Just don't, unless you want to spend an afternoon writing a very angry email about a 30-year-old review. So what I'm saying here is that we all have our favorite version of the characters, but just because a particular version of a character resonates heavily with me doesn't mean it's going to resonate with everybody else. I mean, I personally have a particular attachment to Lady Bertram in the 1983 version of Mansfield Park, and listen, I love everything about the 1995 version, but it is really difficult for me to accept a Lady Bertram who doesn't kind of sigh every one of her lines like she might not get through to the end. And even as I say that, I can hear fans yelling at the screen, but what about Lindsay Duncan? And that's my point. We've all got our favorites, the defining adaptation or character interpretation that nothing can top for us. So even though it might never be your favorite, 2 years out, after a lot of the furor has gone down, I want to talk about some of the good things that Netflix brought us with this version of Persuasion. First, obviously, is Mia McKenna-Bruce as Mary Musgrove. Even among people who absolutely hate this movie, I have yet to hear anything negative about this portrayal. Because you know what? She's not just brilliantly self-obsessed. She brings like this modern day self-centeredness to Mary. We all know this person in the modern world. I mean, I think she would be someone who decides she's going to be an influencer, right? But she can't quite decide where she should influence. Maybe there's a little bit of rather disinterested mommy blogging. I think there's probably a lot of essential oil type things. But those essential oils won't cure her own very particular illnesses, obviously. The first time I watched Persuasion, I was like just completely prepared to hate everything about it. But even then, I laughed loud enough to scare my dog off the sofa every time Mary was talking. To me, this characterization of Mary is actually a really wonderful example of taking a character that could easily be off-putting or fade into the background into comic relief that's accessible and memorable and funny. I just found her to be a really bright spot in this movie when in other versions I'd found Mary to be pretty annoying. So second is the costuming. You guys, the costuming. I put this movie right up there with the 2005 Pride and Prejudice for costuming and for cinematography. I love this aesthetic. It's not historically accurate, but it is beautiful. I mean, check out Anne's dresses, the Musgrove drawing room, Anne's bedroom, just gorgeous. And also in a way that wouldn't look totally out of place in like a modern day anthropology catalog, which I think is also another nod to the audience that they were going for with this movie. Third, Richard E. Grant. This man, just perfection. He is so narcissistic in this movie that he's about to turn into a mirror, which is like probably his worst nightmare, because the only person he wouldn't be able to see is himself, and also he'd have to reflect all of the ugly people. He would just be horrified. I still have a soft spot for Anthony Head's portrayal in the 2007, but I like that Richard E. Grant is older than Anthony Head was in that one, and I think the filmmakers have chosen to show his age a little bit more. It just kind of highlights how increasingly ridiculous his vanity is. My favorite, I could not find a screenshot of, but my favorite piece of Sir Walter in this movie is him telling Anne not to let anyone look at his shrubberies, even as they're carrying this gigantic stately portrait of him out the door in the background, because he's taken that thing to Bath, to his like new smaller digs that he's got because he's spent all of his money, and he still just can't handle not having these like idealized representations of himself around. Fourth, I gotta admit, I am kind of into this version of Wentworth. Like I said before, I think Cosmo Jarvis brought sort of a wryness to the character and a sense of humor. And then I like that the script and the direction both kind of softened the worst of his digs toward Anne. I love Book Wentworth. He is my favorite Austen hero by a long shot. And I have a lot of sympathy for his broken heart and his wounded pride. But I think a lot of the grace that I give to Book Wentworth is because we're given him through Anne's perspective, right? And she both loves him and she believes she is to blame for all of the nasty things that he says. She thinks they're all accurate. And without her perspective, without seeing him like through the eyes of someone who really loves him like Anne does, I think Wentworth is probably a pretty tough character to really empathize with, especially, again, over the course of a 90-minute movie. Also, I want to call out Cosmo Jarvis and his incredibly expressive face, whether he's dialing up the charm for Louisa or wanting to find a really deep ocean to drop Mr. Elliot into. I think that all comes across and it's beautifully done. So that's it. That is my defense for the 2022 version of Persuasion. Is it my favorite? No. Have I watched it upwards of half a dozen times? Yes. But the reason that I'm telling you all of this is not to sway you to my opinion. All I'm asking is that we, the diehard, established Austen fans who have multiple copies of every novel sitting around the house and probably more than one Regency ensemble in our closets, that we keep an open mind and an open fandom for new interpretations and new vision. So whether you were indifferent to the 2022 movie, whether you hated it with a passion, whether you still refuse to watch it, or maybe you're starting to come around a little bit, let's make room for people whose first exposure to Persuasion, and maybe even to Jane Austen, is this movie. Let's have a fandom where we can debate and disagree, but still value each other's opinions and the work of other creators and fans. So thank you so much for watching, and a huge, huge thank you to the creators and volunteers of Virtual JaneCon for providing us this opportunity to celebrate our fandom and our beloved Jane. I would love to connect with you via the comments or on my socials. I told you Wentworth was my favorite. And most of all, I hope you enjoy the con, and I'll see you next year. Bye.